Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. I'm your host, Steve Palley. With me, as usual, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. Galen, you are in a new location today.
Yeah, I'm visiting my dad in California.
California dreaming. Santa Barbara, baby.
Yeah, the irony of visiting my dad, but just being off the East Coast is like what they said in Seinfeld about moving away from your parents. It's like you got more energy, the world seems better, more optimism.
Well, you did go from Western Mass to California, so I feel like there's some counterbalancing going on there.
What I'm saying.
Yeah. Anyway, today we are going to take a step back, sort of, from current events and enter a larger debate about unipolarity or hegemony in the international system. And we are going to talk about whether the United States still qualifies as the global hegemon, whether the international system is still in a unipolar configuration. So, Galen, maybe you can start us off by just defining that a little bit.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. A unipolar system is one in which there is only one great power.
Okay.
Now, it gets a little trickier, as I'm sure we'll get into, when you try to define who counts as a great power and who does not. But assuming you can agree on that part of it, a multipolar system means there are three or more great powers. A bipolar system was what we had during the Cold War, only two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And a unipolar system is there's only one show in town. Everyone agrees that was the case from about 1990 to circa 2010. I guess
Hmm.
play with the latter date a little. And now there's a debate over whether unipolarity has ended, is waning, or is stable.
Got it. And why is this important, right? It sounds like we're counting on our hands how many great powers there are in the international system. Seems kind of silly, seems kind of arbitrary. Why do we care? Why is it relevant?
Well, maybe this is one we can put in conversation with one another because I ask myself this question frequently. I mean, my best answer to it is to the extent that you have to base grand strategy and formulate policy in terms of defining means to ends. What one is able to do is based on the distribution of power globally. And so nailing down what that distribution is, and in particular, if there are viable great power challengers, will have a real impact on what grand strategy one finds appropriate, in this case for the United States. I'm less interested in just like the academic debate of what we should call this conceptually, but as a policy matter, you could argue that if the United States is in decline, maybe it needs to retrench. If it's not, maybe it needs to keep on doing what it's doing. But what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think that the academic debate is fascinating for academics, which I am not anymore. You still are. It sounds like it mostly just pisses you off, which I completely understand. As far as foreign policy goes, that's pretty important. But for people living in the United States classically, they don't care too much about foreign policy, generally speaking. They're more interested in the domestic effects, like how does this affect me directly? And I think, again, living in the United States, at least in our lifetimes, we've been mostly insulated from the effects of foreign policy or the foreign policy of other countries upon domestic conditions in the United States. But recently, we have seen that foreign policies, particularly trade policies, can have big effects on what we can do here, the kinds of goods we can buy, for instance. In the past, we've had, for instance, oil shocks due to foreign policy issues, oil embargoes or wars, right? And that people tend to notice very quickly. So it's not like it's completely irrelevant. And broadly speaking, there's this notion that being the global hegemon, being in charge of the global system, confers what Charles de Gaulle called exorbitant privilege, the ability to raise living standards in the metropole or in the United States. So it's like we've basically had this situation for most of our lives where the United States has been in charge of the international system. It's had the global reserve currency. It's been able to exert itself militarily. A lot of countries wouldn't even challenge it when the United States was definitely unipolar. We could do whatever we wanted. We were the 800-pound gorilla. We got all the best goods, all the best services. We had the best technology. And that was the ocean that we swam in, right? We got used to it. If things are changing, then that's going to be a big change for us. And that is why this debate is relevant to me.
Just because I only just learned this, but actually the quote is often misattributed to de Gaulle. It's
Oh, it's not de Gaulle?
the French finance minister from the 60s, whose name I always mispronounce, so I'm not going to try. But apparently de Gaulle had very similar views talking about the
Let's leave
dollar.
it as the French,
Yeah, the French.
not the biggest fans of the Americans.
But just one thing you said that seemed important in terms of domestic politics or how Americans think about foreign policy. I guess another reason this matters is one argument I find convincing is that during the period of unquestioned US unipolar dominance, the US was able to do a lot of stupid stuff
Yes, and it did.
because it had such an enormous margin of security and there was such a gap between it and whoever the second power, probably China, was at the time, that it could afford to do stupid stuff. Well, not that we should be doing stupid things anyway, but if we can now really not afford to do those things, that might be a reason why this is important.
Absolutely. And we'll get into that. We'll get into the notion of being able to afford things and how that actually works, because this is another sort of area that is directly relevant to our standard of living in the United States. It's this idea that the United States is an extremely serious debt. And I don't know if we want to have that conversation now or if we want to start a little bit more with
Let's
policy.
do it. Let's do it. As good a time as any, just because as we were just talking before we started recording, I'll just put my cards on the table. I have always found there's a very famous book from the 80s by a guy named Paul Kennedy who used to teach at Yale called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. Now, that book gets a lot of grief. I remember one of our mutual mentors, Art Stein at UCLA, making the point that one should never include a date in the title of a book that has yet to come yet. So I believe the subtitle of that book includes something like Economic Change from 1500 to 2000. The book was published, I think, in 87. And so he predicts in that book that the United States is going to go into serious decline. And that's really all anyone remembers from that book, because,
Mm-hmm.
of course, the Cold War ends a few years later and the United States becomes this overwhelming hegemon. But the core argument of the book has always had a deep impact on me and still, I think, is basically right, which is the countries that rise to prominence and become great powers in the systems are the ones that are very strong economically. Having a big, strong economy allows for things like technological innovation. It allows you to support large militaries. It allows you to buy diplomatic influence. It gives you all sorts of things. And so his argument is it's kind of the bedrock of a country's power base. And to me, I think that argument really does well. A number of people have built on it in the subsequent decades. Robert Pape at the University of Chicago had a paper on this back in like 2009. I think it was called Empire Falls, where he basically predicted the United States was going to decline because of overextension internationally, but more so the erosion of its technological and economic edges. This is really a debate we're seeing right now. Peter Orszag, President Obama's budget director, just had an op-ed in the New York Times saying it's time to freak out about US debt for a variety of reasons. And so to me, this is really arguably the key hinge point for this whole debate is whether the US economy and the US technological edge are seriously waning. So I'll just start there and throw it back to you, whether you think that's the
That's,
case.
yeah. So, one measurement that people like us like to look at, and this is not necessarily decisive. I think it's just an interesting and important and frightening heuristic is whether the interest on the national debt exceeds the amounts of money spent on defense, right? And it's like that's not necessarily like the death knell of an empire because you can continue to borrow money. But it's kind of like a frightening indicator where
Yeah.
it's like you now owe more money than you spend projecting power. And interest on the debt serves no purpose other than allowing you, hopefully, to continue to borrow more money in the future, right? It like you're not necessarily like doing anything productive with it. If you are borrowing money and building factories, making it easier or better, like investing in technology, whatever, or even spending money on the military to, for instance, open up sea lanes or support allies, something like that, then it can make sense. If you are borrowing money and wasting it on unproductive activities, then you are entering basically a downward spiral. And there's a lot of evidence that the United States is now in a downward spiral. We are spending more money on the interest for the national debt than we are spending on defense. And it's getting worse. We we're on the verge of passing a huge tax cut that will be unfunded, adding even more to the national debt, which is, I think, into the 30 trillions at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. That's correct.
GDP of the United States, like we're exceeding 100% of
Right.
GDP.
Which like just to build on something like a lot of these metrics are no, they're not like solid rules, right? They're
They're
kind
not.
of lines. But like in general, I remember seeing like you generally don't want debt as a percentage of GDP above 60%.
Right. And we've been above 60% for a while,
Yeah.
and the United States has continued to be invested in by the entire world. But the thing is, it's like if your buddy is drunk and like acting erratically, and has a bunch of problems and is saying crazy stuff and doing things that you don't like, are you more or less likely to continue to lend him money?
Yeah.
Like a lot of this comes down to credibility and belief in others that our system will continue to function and we will continue to be able to pay them back in the future.
And that is why this was not the first ratings agency to do this, but what it was Moody's, right? That just
Yep.
downgraded. Okay, so
It was the last of the three major
Moody's,
ones.
Standard and Poor's, and I can't remember the third one. But
Me
yeah,
either.
it was the last one to strip the United States of its AAA credit rating. Now,
Hmm.
that sounds kind of jargony and unimportant. Suffice it to say, that's important because essentially what those agencies are doing are giving the United States government a grade on how likely it is to be able to repay its debts.
Hmm.
The downgrade is important because to the extent people are less certain that the United States will make good on its debts, people can demand a higher rate of return for lending the United States government money.
Interest rates go up.
Interest rates
And
go up. Now, for a long time, people made the argument, hey, yes, the US debt isn't that, it's big, it's not ideal, but we had over 100% of debt to GDP during World War II. Now I'm always quick to point out, yeah, that's because we were fighting World War II.
are we fighting World War II right now?
But beyond that, the argument was this is a level of debt that's manageable because interest rates are so low. And the concern that people like myself have had for a long time is like, well, what if they don't stay low forever? And they have not. And this has been a concern for people doing like military budgeting for a long time is once interest rates go up, and as you said, the United States is now spending more servicing debt payments than it is on defense, Medicare, or Medicaid. That crowds out investment elsewhere.
Crowds out investment. And yeah, you get this sort of like downward spiral or negative feedback loop going. And historically, we have seen this type of negative feedback loop result in, frankly, state collapse, imperial collapse. Now, this doesn't mean that the United States is going to fall apart anytime soon or ever, right? But it could mean that we can no longer fund military that is world class. And not just world class, but like three times more capable than the next biggest military, which is probably China.
Yeah.
Um, and it may mean that we cannot project power anywhere on Earth. It may mean that we cannot maintain a network of hundreds of military bases everywhere on Earth.
Like for some people, that's not necessarily a bad thing, which we can
Right.
talk about because there's an argument that another piece of this has to do with US overextension. But, it does get to this second point. I mean, I don't, if you have more to say on the debt, let's stick there. But that we're already seeing regional powers or potential challengers able to do things that they weren't able to do during the period of unquestioned unipolarity. So even people like who we've mentioned on the show, Steve Brooks and William Woolforth at Dartmouth, who have been making the argument that the system is unquestionably unipolar and likely to stay that way for about a quarter of a century now. And as recently as a couple years ago, had a foreign affairs piece called The Myth of Multipolarity. Even they're kind of now saying we're still in unipolarity, but like it's a less clear-cut unipolarity. It's like partial unipolarity.
It's like being partially pregnant, in my opinion. It's either you are or you aren't.
Well, we can sort of look at their arguments if you want to, but like the point being, even they're saying it's unlikely that Russia would have invaded Ukraine in 1998. The concerns about Taiwan were relatively minor 25 to 30 years ago. And they're saying those are now areas where challengers like China and Russia can afford to do things that they couldn't have several decades ago.
Yeah. What I would say to that is it's true, certainly, but it takes two to tango. And Russia has reconstituted a lot of, not a lot, but at least some of its capabilities after the fall of the Soviet Union. China has undergone an economic miracle over the last 30 years, right? So it's not all about what the United States is doing,
Right.
whether or not it's declined. It's also about relative decline when it comes to these types of challenges. And I would say it's also not Russia and China, not just Russia and China. We have regional powers like Iran, which is very far away from being a great power, I would say.
Yeah,
Um,
and this is a point where I agree with people like Brooks and Woolforth. Like the United States and China, if we want to debate whether it's unipolar or bipolar, we can do that. But I do put them in a different class than Russia, which is probably in a different class from Iran or Japan or even India. So there is kind of this hierarchy where we could maybe have some disagreements on exact ordering, but I think the US and China really are in a different class at this point.
yeah, but point being, Iran, might be getting ready to call the United States' bluff around its nuclear program. And we did a show on that a few weeks ago. And they are in trouble in a lot of different ways. But people looking at the United States from the outside in might perceive the United States to be in trouble, whether or not it recognizes it. Um, and so they might be ready to say, like, okay, we didn't get a deal that we agreed to. We want to maintain some degree of enrichment capability for our nuclear fuel, right? For a civilian program. You're not going to let us do that. So let's do it. Let's fight. Bring
Yeah.
it.
And
Yeah.
actually, this is a perfect example because we already kind of have a past, what's the word, like relevant comparison. So when the United States invaded Iraq in
Oh, yeah.
2003, just about the only silver lining of that catastrophic decision, which has a direct bearing on what we're discussing today, by the way, was the Iranians halted their nuclear program because they feared that they were next on the list, which I think they probably were. They also reportedly made an offer of a kind of grand bargain with the United States at that time. That would not happen today.
No. And it's not, it is in fact not happening.
Yes. I don't want to get off topic, but I see no way that the Iranians cede their right to enrich uranium as part of this negotiation. 20 years ago, might have been a different story.
Yeah, because we would have credibility connected to capability and intent, political will, right? And I think capability probably isn't eroding in an absolute sense yet in the United States, but it is eroding in a relative sense versus China and Russia and even Iran. Iran has a gigantic like autonomous weapons industry now. And we do too, but it's like they didn't have those capabilities 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Nobody did other than the United States.
This gets to the other part, which frankly, this is another kind of like vibes based debate.
Yeah.
So I'm more interested in hearing what you have to say. But this strikes me as potentially the most important piece in the kind of US hegemon optimist camp, which is aside from US economic vitality, the main source of American power on the world stage is its technological edge. So,
Hmm.
very frequent argument you see is the United States spends a huge amount of money in R&D. It still leads in things like human capital. I'm kind of leaving aside very recent events, which may or may not have a bearing on these things, but the US university system, the envy of the world. It leads in high-end patents. If you look at semiconductors, we talked about weaponized interdependence on a previous episode, this idea put forth by Farrell and Newman that the United States has or control over these critical choke points. The semiconductor industry is one where US companies just dominate the software industry that designs chips. These sources of technological strength are enormously important, both economically and militarily. But I take it you think that gap is much smaller than it used to be.
I think that's right. I think particularly if you look at China, they have either matched or exceeded us in a number of next generation technologies, energy technologies, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles. They're ahead of us now, like unquestionably. Battery storage. It's like there's a long list. I think we're still ahead in biotech,
You
but
think they're ahead in AI?
well, that's a good question. And we did an episode on DeepSeek. It was one of our first
Yeah,
episodes, right? They're not necessarily ahead of us, but they are competing with us successfully.
yeah.
I don't think there's any question about that. And AI is perhaps the most important of these if you believe that it is the key that will unlock all these other doors, right? This
Quantum computing, another one.
Yep. Yep. And the Chinese have a very long-term state-sponsored strategy to invest in these areas, and it's working. The United States used to do this too with things like space flight, atomic power, and so on. And it kind of doesn't so much anymore. There are some noises out of the Trump administration. It's like, we want to do big things again. We want to make long-term investments in these technological areas. We've leveraged the private sector to do a lot of this. So Elon Musk, SpaceX, and yeah, there's a bunch of other new scale. It's the modular reactor company
Hmm.
that
Yeah, yeah.
just got permitted recently. So there is a lot of activity in this area in the United States, but it is connected to our educational base. It is connected to talent from all over the world wanting to come here, right? And you alluded to recent developments in these areas, like perhaps causing problems.
Yeah.
Some of these people might end up going to Canada. Some of them might end up going to China, like the best scientific talent. A lot of the best scientific talent comes from China.
Well,
And
and I think it was just announced that the administration is revoking
correct.
visas of Chinese students.
Yeah, to me, this is a grievous act of self-harm. Maybe not in the short run, but like it will have fairly immediate effects because like when it comes to technological innovation, it's accelerating. And it's like we could see this downstream from us 1, 3, 5 years in the future. It's like those people stay in China, those scientists, and they contribute to Chinese technological dominance in these areas, right? And to me, this is an own goal. This is like it's a policy. It's a policy choice. It's not a thing that we had to do. And to whatever extent you think it's a determinant of like hegemonic state power, it's a serious problem. The other aspect of this is we can get into the offense defense balance a little bit. This is another idea from international relations where certain technologies military technologies are better on defense than they are on offense. Obviously, a shield, for instance, can be used offensively too, because it lets you hit without being worried about getting hit back, right? But autonomous weapon systems, drones in particular, have diffused across the world missile technology. Everybody has ballistic missiles now. Some countries have hypersonic missiles, which can evade even our missile defenses, which are generally regarded as best in class, right? So they retain the ability to hit us in a way that they didn't necessarily have 20 or even 10 years ago, right? Meanwhile, the United States is actually playing catch up when it comes to hypersonics. And we can debate whether or not this actually matters. There's arguments both ways, but I think it is like indicative of this larger idea where it's like these new technologies make it easier to resist the United States. It makes it easier to become a great power or a regional power and operate in your own particular area of influence. It makes hegemony harder, basically. So that's a different idea than the decline or rise of the United States, but it is still relevant, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like there's two sides to the coin, which is like stupid stuff the US is doing, and then the rest catching up for
Mm-hmm.
reasons of technological diffusion, or this is a classic theory in international relations with a changing of the guard of who's hegemon, Robert Gilpin, War and Change in World Politics, right?
Yep.
Eventually, if you're the hegemon, you end up having to take on more commitments, and those commitments end up costing you. And eventually, there's a hegemonic war, and you get a new top dog. So there might be some ways in which US relative decline is just inevitable as a matter of course. And then there are ways maybe we are just acting foolishly that are accelerating those. But I mean, I guess what if I made the bold case for unipolar optimists and you can respond?
So
Okay.
are you going to make that case?
Yeah, I'll just make the case. I'll
Okay.
try to be brief. Yeah, the US fiscal irresponsibility is not great, but if you look at the net worth of the United States, I think I've seen estimates in the like 130 to 140 trillion dollar range. The country's awash in money. It just needs to mobilize using it the right way. So it's a political problem. And once the political stakes or the, I guess, interest rate stakes go high enough, it'll get its house in order. By historical terms, the United States still doesn't actually spend that much on defense as a percentage of GDP. We're down between like 3 and 4% at the moment. Recent events notwithstanding, the United States still has the best universities in the world. It still has, in terms of high class technology and R&D, it probably is still the world leader in those types of sectors. And other countries that might plausibly challenge the United States have arguably bigger problems. So, one thing you frequently hear said about Russia is its economy is about the size of Italy's. It has enormous societal and political problems that it's going to have to deal with, and the war in Ukraine is only making things worse. China is the better contender, probably, but it also has serious debt problems, a slowing economy. It's got horrific pollution. Unlike the United States, its geography is not very favorable. And even though it has this partnership with Russia, they're more natural adversaries than allies, but it also is surrounded by countries that don't like it very much, some of which are pretty powerful, like India and Japan. And it has a crippling demographic problem due to the legacy of the one child policy. And that's going to really start biting its ability to continue to rise. So I guess those would be the cases.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to you list out all of these strengths and advantages that the United States has still, I was nodding my head. It's like, yes, all of that is true. And these other countries that might challenge the United States for hegemony do have extremely serious problems, like unquestionably. I've also heard the argument that the United States is actually pretty well set up, relatively speaking, for the era of climate change.
Uh,
And
in terms of the impact it will have on it.
correct.
Okay.
It's like it's gonna basically hurt everybody, but it's gonna hurt some countries way more
Okay.
than
I
the
thought you were
US.
saying in terms of what the US has done to stem it, in which
Oh, that's
case.
completely different and much more depressing to talk about.
Yeah.
But like China is like super vulnerable in terms of like water supply and topsoil and things like that. Like the US is actually in fairly decent shape as far as those things go. So that could be, you could call it a card in our favor, but what it really is, it's just not going to be as bad for us
Yeah.
compared to everybody else, right? Um,
Yeah,
all right.
it's
So
not going to be good for anyone.
it's not going to be good for us. Yeah, it's not going to be good. The United States is still a very rich society. I think what this boils down to for me, though, is politics within the United States and what the people of the United States actually want to do. Because the United States is still a democratic country. And we were talking about this earlier. Using the minimal definition of democracy, at least two political parties that have different policies and they alternate in power. So, by that definition, the United States is a democracy, and we don't know for sure, but we'll probably stay a democracy. I'm not 100% on that, but probably. And so it needs to be responsive to what the voters want. And the voters have seemingly chosen a different direction in the United States. The United States could have continued with hegemonic policies around trade, around security deployment, and yeah, particularly alliances, right? But a bunch of people in this country voted for a party and a politician who was like, now we're spending too much money on this stuff. We don't need a lot allies at all, really. So you could argue that the United States is doing what it wants to do, and it doesn't want to be hegemon anymore. And we've seen this before. Not it's not the same circumstances at all, but the British Empire at the end of World War II, because the UK couldn't afford it anymore. But at the same time, the voters in the UK voted in the socialists.
I mean,
And
you could even say it's happened in the United States, like after the First World War.
true.
Now, I wouldn't say the US was a hegemon, but it was probably the strongest power in the world. And the United States opted not to become heavily involved in international politics and
Yeah,
this classic period of American isolationism prior to World War II.
that's a great point. Yeah, no, they basically the US turned down the mantle of global leadership, and that caused a lot of problems later on, as we all well know. And it seems like maybe we're doing that again.
So
Now,
I do just want to there is a claim that it actually would be more in the US interests. I guess now we're kind of talking about what good is power unless you're using it. But there are plenty of analysts who claim that if the goal is to preserve US power and extend the period of unipolarity, if that is indeed still the system we're living in, that part of the problem was US overextension. Fareed Zakaria had a thing on this in Foreign Affairs a few years ago about how the US squandered the unipolar moment. The most important piece of that for people like him is the Iraq War. Another point that's being made now, and which people give Trump credit for, in my view, rightly, is the US shift on China, that the critique of US China policy for 30 years now, with the benefit of retrospect, not that there weren't people who were saying it at the time, was the US basically has been propping up its biggest now rival. And for people at the time, it was clearly going to be its future rival. And so that this policy of engagement didn't make any sense. And so there is a way in the minds of these analysts in which US involvement in this vast alliance system or the US being hyper involved in world affairs actually doesn't necessarily promote US hegemony.
yeah, or US interests domestically,
Yeah,
right? And I think you and I are very sympathetic to the idea that we screwed up Iraq really badly to the
I
like,
think everyone is now. I don't think.
yeah, it's not a super controversial point of view. Where to the tune of like trillions of dollars and however many thousands of casualties and so on. Again, Trump in 2016, 2015 as well, won the GOP primary by taking out the Bushes on Iraq, like very directly. And like he deserves a lot of credit for that.
And well, and Obama in 2008 hung that around Clinton's neck in the Democratic.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Afghanistan, it's like we withdrew from Afghanistan under Biden. I was in favor of the move. I don't think I was necessarily in favor of like the way it went down. Right?
It's hard to say that it could have been any worse in terms of how
Yeah.
it's implemented.
Yeah, it was
I'm
pretty
with you.
disastrous. Yeah. But high level, it's like, do we need to be there forever? No, right? It's what were we doing, right? It was like founding a colony on the surface of Mars. It's like, yes, you might be able to do it, but to what end? It's still Mars,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah, that's going to be a resource sink basically forever. And that's what it would take. It would take
Most of what I used to
garrisoning.
ask people like circa 2016 that were like, no, we need to stay. I'd be like, so year 16 is the year that it's gonna pay off,
Yeah,
right?
it's all going to turn around, right? It's like, no, there's zero evidence, right? Yeah. So it's like there's a lot to sympathize with in the idea of like imperial retrenchment and not getting into like pointless foreign wars. Trump is serious. I think we've seen that he's serious about avoiding military adventurism. And I
Yeah.
think like that's a really good aspect of his policy. The question is whether anybody believes that he's willing to get into any fights anymore at this point.
And
I don't know
the
that,
Iranians don't, to your point. And
yeah, like they don't seem to. And we've heard the TACO acronym against Trump.
yeah, I just saw this. What does it mean again?
I don't know. I got to look it up really fast. Trump TACO.
Yeah, I
Let's
just saw
see.
this like yesterday, but I can't remember it now.
The taco trade. Yes. Trump always chickens out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And this is really pissing him off.
Yeah, I
But
saw it. He's just
it's
enraged.
true. It's like he talks a big game. He's a big bluffer, right? Gets a lot of leverage, but like when the chips are down, it's like, oh, like he backs away. And we've seen this on trade, right? I don't know if we're going to continue seeing it because now he's really pissed off. But he has a reputation, right, for like trying to scare people and secure the best possible deal. But if there's resistance, just giving up and walking away, right? Once you have that reputation, it's like, you might be able to secure some easy wins without doing anything, but eventually you have to reestablish credibility. It's like, well, when and how is that going to happen, right? Are we actually going to get into a foreign military adventure in Iran? That would be pretty unpopular with MAGA, I think.
I, yeah, we talked about this. I don't think that's going to happen. We've talked about Russia, Ukraine.
Right.
He seems, now that he doesn't think a deal is that easy, he seems content with telling Vladimir to stop. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Please stop.
but I think he wants to like wash his hands of that situation. He clearly wants to hand off more responsibility to European security to NATO.
Yep.
And I think we touched briefly on at least based on what he has said, certainly compared to Biden, seems a lot less interested in going to war over Taiwan.
That's the sort of remaining open question, and it's a really important one. Maybe the most important one. It's not like the US has cut military budget under Trump. Like we're
No,
continuing to, I think, invest and even increase military budget, which just makes the future debt problems even more serious. And if nobody believes that we're going to use it, right? The difference during the unipolar moment was that we were so far ahead of everybody else and they believed that we would use it. So they never even got started in challenging us. Like they just didn't step to us. Like people are stepping to us now.
yeah, which there's a famous Pentagon document that I think is attributed to Paul Wolfowitz, who later was considered kind of the intellectual architect of the Iraq War.
And neoconservatism, right?
From 1992. I forget what it's titled, but basically the key argument that you see in the document, which is taught in every post-Cold War American foreign policy class, is that the goal should be to prevent any other state from even thinking about challenging US hegemony. That the US lead will just be so considerable, there's not even really a point in challenging the United States in any of these key power indices. Yeah, that to me seems like a completely different world at this point. I don't think we're at all living in that universe.
Yeah, and if that's how you define unipolarity, then this isn't unipolarity. It might be bipolarity or multipolarity, but it's not unipolarity because like people are challenge countries are challenging the United States all over the place, starting with China,
Yeah, and
you
I
know?
guess like if again, you're right that a lot of this comes down to like vibes, which is not a good place to be as a social scientist analyst. But like to me, it's the sort of thing that it seems like if the United States could get its act together and put together some sensible policy solutions to these things, I might feel differently. And in fact, we might live in a fundamentally different world at this point. But, for many years, one of my former mentors used to make this point about things like the debt. It's not a solvency problem, it's a political problem. From the standpoint of 2025, that's like cold comfort. I remember some of the negotiations during the Obama presidency leading to things like the sequester. I think that was in 2011, being like, well, this seems like the real crisis you would need. It's a sort of thing where if the United States could get its own house in order, I'd be more inclined to think that its staying power would be a lot better. But these are problems that we are not able to solve politically. Like, again, if we return to the fiscal situation, the only way that this works, and people as old as we are remember the Bowles-Simpson Commission, like on how you could actually sustainably bring US debt into a good position. And surprise, they were like, we need a combination of spending cuts and tax raises.
Mhm.
Of course, that's the only way the math works. And we've done neither. We are spending more. And like, this is one, by the way, this is the one area where Donald Trump has not been able to impose his will on the totality of the Republic.
Notably,
The
notably.
only thing I could like, he has a iron grip, a stranglehold on that party. He can humiliate people within the party and then get them to be his Secretary of State.
And national security advisor.
Yes. The only thing that he is not able to do was there was this notable moment with the current negotiations about his big, beautiful bill was he briefly suggested, hey, maybe we could raise taxes on the very wealthiest Americans. And
I remember
immediately
that.
the GOP was like, no, we're not doing that. He was like, all right, never mind. That's the one thing. So that seems like a non-starter. And then on the left, whether for legitimate negotiating purposes, hey, for every dollar cut, we need X number of dollars raised from tax revenue, or because politically it's really difficult to cut entitlements, we're not doing anything on that either.
Yeah.
Um, Things like immigration. It's no secret now. I think there was just a report out that the US birth rate fell in 2023 to its lowest point ever. The US has typically been the envy of the industrialized, economically developed world for its demography. It's no longer the case, and that's in large part because of US immigration policies. These are problems that are solvable with like reasonable compromises politically. And I see no evidence that we're going to start doing any of them.
Yeah.
So the rest of the world can have all the problems they want. But I think there is a point at which if you keep shooting yourself in the foot, you're going to have serious problems when it comes to sustaining your power position internationally.
Yeah, there's kind of two ways this can go. The easier way and the hard way, because there is no easy way anymore when it comes to getting our fiscal house in order. We can vote for it. We can vote for austerity, which sometimes happens in democracy, but very often not. The last time we got anything approaching austerity was actually during the Clinton administration, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, but even that was just like the US economy boomed so much in the 90s.
Yeah, it worked out fine and like people didn't notice so much, I
Yeah,
think.
because the economy was doing so well. But yes, the last time the US had a budget surplus, I think, was 2000.
Yeah, it's been a while. So you can vote in politicians if they exist who are budget hawks who will raise taxes and cut benefits. Entitlements, the main federal entitlements seem to be completely untouchable. in both parties.
They're
Understand
on
that.
autopilot within the budget. They're
Yeah,
non-discretionary spending and have
that's
been
right.
for quite a while.
You would have to pass legislation. That's hard to do. The next line item is military. Neither party seems to want to cut military, right? So that's not happening. Raising taxes seems to be impossible. It's simply impossible, right? So that's one
Certainly
path.
on the Republican side. I mean, I
Yeah.
think the last Republican to do it was the first George Bush, and one of the
How'd that work out for him?
for why he didn't get reelected was he had the famous read my lips, no new taxes. And just to be clear, the debt is a bipartisan issue. Like,
1,000,000,000,000,000,000%, dude.
yes.
Yeah. Everybody in the United States is responsible for the
Yes.
national debt. Some would argue the GOP is more responsible, others would not. It doesn't matter. Both parties are responsible. Everybody living in the United States is responsible at this point in time. The hard way is the bond market steps in. And all this
Which
means,
it might be already.
yeah, it might be already. All this means, it's very simple, is they just take the car keys away from the drunk guy. And they're like, yeah, we're not going to give you any more money because we don't trust you anymore. And okay,
Yeah.
like we'll let you finance some stuff, but it's going to be at a very high rate of interest. When that happens, the party stops. And it can stop abruptly. Like the cops show up and everything gets shut down. You have a sovereign debt crisis, which was unthinkable in the United States until fairly recently, I would say. We could
Yeah.
do a show on sovereign debt crises. That's not a lot of fun when that
Scary
goes
stuff.
down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then you start to look like Argentina, Indonesia, Turkey, someplace like that. And like the real political extremists come out of the woodwork and social order breaks down. It's
And
not
then
great.
the other piece of this is I think there's a misconception out there that US debt is primarily held by foreign countries.
It is not.
It's not even close, but something like around a third of it is.
Mhm.
And I think it comes to something like 9 or 10 trillion dollars. Well, if those countries stop buying US debt, that
Or God forbid if they start selling it.
correct. That potentially could be pretty catastrophic.
Yeah. Yeah. I think over half of US debt is held by American individuals and companies and pension funds and stuff like that.
I think, yes, 70% is in some way owned by the US public. The Fed, I
Yeah.
think, owns a decent chunk, like state and local governments own a fair amount of it.
Yeah.
It's like 70% of it is held by a US entity of some kind.
But like a hardcore program of austerity in the United States, what would that look like? I mean, that would look like the military budget getting cut in half. That would look like all, like most, if not all, discretionary spending like stop. That would look like immediate tax raises. It would, I'm sure, generate a recession, it'd generate unemployment. It would be really nasty in a way that we just haven't seen since like the 70s or 80s. Basically, I mean, you could say the Great Recession to a certain extent.
Yeah. Now,
Um,
like, look, that's a good example because I think I come down on the more pessimistic side. I do think that we have a tendency to overlook these serious problems and challenges that other countries have.
sure,
Some
because
of,
we're not as familiar with them.
yeah,
We don't live
yeah.
there.
Nevertheless, I just, as a consumer and observer of American politics, like, I can't even make sense of it most of the time. So to think we're going to have some massive piece of legislation that actually addresses these issues, like I've been waiting my entire adult life for that. And in some cases, there have been serious crises when you would expect there to be opportunities to do so, and it hasn't happened. That said, the Great Recession is a good example of a point that the optimists could make, right? Like the Great Recession was largely due to factors related to the US housing market and a number of things that happened in the United States. And while the coming out of that was slow, painful, and difficult, especially for many ordinary Americans, the US ended up doing, I would argue, a lot better than most of the rest of the world. And until relatively recently, if you look at comparisons with other OECD countries, the United States was doing quite well economically. And so that's kind of the counterpoint that you'll see, which is like the US will always be the most resilient. I just think that there is a period when that runs out if we don't start taking some steps here.
I agree. So much of it depends on the belief of others that the United States will continue to be as it always has been. And if the United States starts to act erratically, if like policies change in a very big way, in ways that we haven't seen for not just decades, but like a century, it's like that raises big questions in the minds of other countries, people in other countries, as to whether they want to put their money here. Like U.S. treasuries have been like the backstop of the entire international economy since World War II, period, full stop, right? And particularly within our lifetimes. It's that has been the exorbitant privilege of the United States, the ability to issue our own debt and have anybody and everybody buy it every time. And the ability to print our own currency and have everybody demand it 100% of the time. That is what has allowed us to finance things the way that we have, right? That is what has allowed us to be so stupid, frankly, and profligate. And but at a certain point, everybody runs out of money, and other people either want to give you more or they don't. And that's what this whole thing boils down to. The rest of the world has a vote. Individuals have a vote, and they just don't like what they're seeing out of the United States right now. And frankly, they haven't liked it for a while. Like the people that are paying close attention to this stuff, they've had questions, not just during Trump's tenure, but even before that, as
Yeah.
to how we're handling our business, right? And like, I think things have certainly accelerated recently. I don't think there's any question about that. You can see it in the data on the bond market, but it's like, no, like there have been issues before this.
The last piece I'll say of that, like, I myself am not a huge believer in the whole the US gets all these advantages from the liberal world order. Maybe we can talk about that in another episode, but there is a line of thinking out there that the US benefits massively from this alliance system that it has put in place since World War II. And that the reason it's able to do that without bringing about a counterbalancing coalition is one, maybe the alternatives aren't very good. Sort of like we were talking about with the reserve currency being the dollar, just the alternatives aren't great. In this case, like the alternative hegemons or leaders of the world order are like China, Russia. I don't think these are necessarily attractive models, but part of this argument hinges on the US being able to credibly signal that it is interested in strategic restraint, as well as providing things like security guarantees that provide incentives for these allies to buy into this US order. Well, like these are connected with these economic issues we're talking about. It's all embedded in this larger system. The concern of people in that camp right now is if the United States is not only shooting itself in the foot fiscally and with military overextension, if it is also stepping back from these alliances and withdrawing these security guarantees and bullying allies, and you will get counterbalancing behavior, or you will get countries looking for alternatives, and that will drive up the costs to the United States of playing
Well,
dozen.
yeah, and like, why would our allies then continue to finance
Right.
our crazy lifestyle, right? It's like when we were protecting them, it's like, okay, this is, you guys are absurd, but like, we'll do it. We'll keep buying your debt.
Yeah. And I think the best example of that sort of like is probably Germany, right? Like Germany,
Hmm.
West Germany during the Cold War paid what were called offset payments to the United States. Like basically what kind of Trump is always talking about, like paying partially for the costs of stationing US troops there and providing security to the country. Well, like if the US is perceived as a bully or no longer a country that countries like Germany are interested in allying with, that's the sort of thing that the plug could get pulled on as well, right?
Yeah. Nobody says that these countries have to continue buying US debt.
Okay, so bottom line, I guess, are we multipolar, bipolar, unipolar, and do you think that the US is set on a course of relative decline in the next 10 to 20 years?
I think the United States has been in relative decline, mostly having to do with the rise of other countries, having a little bit less to do with the United States declining in an absolute sense. I think the United States could start declining in an absolute sense relatively soon, but that's not guaranteed. I think that we have not been in a unipolar moment for a while. And I don't know like when to date it from exactly, but maybe
Tough.
10 years. Yeah, 10, 15 years, something like that. Anywhere from 5 to 15 years. I think we've been like, I don't know if you call it multipolarity or bipolarity. I lean towards bipolarity just because China has like sprinted ahead in so many ways along so many metrics, even militarily. And I'm not sure what the relative measurements are vis-a-vis like when we were in bipolarity during the Cold War and everybody agreed versus the US versus China now. So like they're number one and two in a lot of metrics, right? Versus everybody else and how everybody else ranks. That would be what I would look at. But I just get the sense that like we're going to end up in a bipolar configuration if we're not already there.
Well, this is totally boring because I basically agree with everything you said.
Okay. Boo, lame.
I, yeah, I think, I don't know what you want to call it, but we're either in solid bipolarity or like solid bipolarity adjacent.
Yes.
I also don't know when to date that, but your time frame sounds about right to me. And I think probably we're going to witness some continued US relative to decline. I think the one thing we might slightly disagree on, I think I attribute a lot of this to US policy
Hmm.
in basically the 21st century. Like
Yeah, I think the point you made about us subsidizing the rise of China, it's probably correct. It's like underwriting their entry to the WTO and all of that was a really big deal.
and endless wars, global war on terror, and above all, what we were discussing with US fiscal irresponsibility and not making you made this point in an earlier episode. Debt isn't necessarily bad
No.
if you are using it to invest, make long-term investments in things like education or technology or what have you. And I just think we've been spending our money on pretty stupid stuff, uh,
Yeah, we've been lighting it on fire.
or at least using it very inefficiently, right?
Yeah. The
So,
Chinese, like, look, they have ghost cities and all that sort of thing, just
yeah,
like gigantic real estate with nobody living in it. But they've done a pretty good job investing in their like capital base, in their educational base, in their technological base. And yeah, over time, that stuff really pays dividends.
by the way, though, a good example of like maybe we need to look at other countries' problems a little more. Like, by some accounts, China's debt situation is far more catastrophic than the United States is. It's a little hard to tell because no one knows whether to trust their numbers. And so much of
Short
their
answer is no,
Yeah,
don't.
and so much of their debt is organized in pretty opaque ways that make doing calculations of this a little tough. And yeah, things like building enormous, like you can go watch some of these things on YouTube, like enormous ghost cities, just wasted dollars. And they had a real estate bubble pop not so long ago. So
Yep.
there are legitimate arguments on the other side, but I just really worry about, frankly, the US not having its own house in order on a lot of these things.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think it's been in order for a while. And not to say that it can't get back in order. Like I think prospects are at least for that are decent,
Yeah.
but I have no idea what's going to happen. And that's one of the things you learn about. Maybe the most important lesson of graduate school is that the more you learn about this stuff, the more you come to see that you don't know anything and should not try to predict anything.
That's one of my favorite sayings. If you read one book, you know everything. If you read 20 books, you know nothing.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's really true. So,
Speaking of,
anyway,
should we do book corner?
yeah, what are you reading?
Here, I gotta pick it up. It's underneath my laptop.
Ooh, look at that.
Just came out, Iran's Grand Strategy by
Cool.
Vali Nasser at Johns Hopkins, I believe.
Uh-huh.
Basically starts with Well, he talks about the Shah era and the 1953 coup somewhat at the beginning, but it's mainly a look at the sources of Iran's grand strategy since the 1979 revolution and how deeply baked into that strategy. He doesn't necessarily say it's an ideology, but anti-Americanism, anti-imperialism more broadly, and a kind of belief that the United States and other powers are out to undermine it domestically through mobilizing internal enemies that has led to a grand strategy of what he calls resistance. So if he's right, and having read a lot about Iran, I'm not totally sure he is, but if he's right, it doesn't, my takeaway would be there's not really much room for any sort of major deal between Iran and the United States over the long term that normalizes relations and leads to a more stable relationship. The
It's
prospect,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, area studies experts like to come up with fancy wrappers for ideologies and movements in different countries, vis-a-vis the Chinese Communist Party, vis-a-vis the revolutionary Iranians, theocracy or whatever, right? And my question about that stuff is always just like, is this really any different than like just nationalism?
So this is like it was a little. I had questions reading it of like it sounds like he wants to argue it's not about ideology.
Hmm.
Nationalism is a sort of ideology, one could argue, but like it seems like it is. And I'm not unsympathetic to that argument. Like, that's not to say the United States has not made its share of mistakes and the Iranians don't have legitimate grievances with
Oh yeah.
Washington. But when I look back at the sweep of the last, whatever, 45 years or so, it does seem like they have been quite difficult to do business with.
Yeah. True. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Awesome. I've got nothing to report for Book Corner. I gotta get on it.
That's all right. We'll do it
Yeah.
next time.
All right. Cool. Well, good session.
Yeah, man.
All right.
Enjoying the weather.
Yes. Enjoy the weather and talk soon.
All right. Later, man.